So now we build from chapter 21 by talking about what do these policies specifically look like when we turn to the environment and sustainability, and how do we balance that against how economists generally make decisions. Okay, so again, especially since this is an ecological economics course, again, sustainability is going to be pretty important. We accept the fact that we're going to limit the size of the economy and economic growth in order to achieve that sustainability. And again, if we don't do that, as this kind of says here, the image of a globe with a graph symbolizing resource depletion. Yes, if we don't, limit economic growth, then economic activity never ceasing to increase would consume the entire world. So we know we need policies, right? We talked in the previous chapter about how you would possibly develop those policies, right? You would develop them according to the scale of the problem. You would have as many policies as you have problems that you envision. You would balance the control aspect with giving individuals some micro level freedoms. You'd have a margin of error that exists to kind of balance things. But what is that? But still, we need to balance that again with needing an economy to grow. And you might ask yourself, well, why do we need that economy to grow? Well, we need it to grow so that we can feed the people. And there's always this kind of idea, at least since since you start seeing it really with the Middle Ages, is that every succeeding generation is better off than the previous generation. So this idea that you want people to, children have better than their parents did. But economic growth wouldn't be just good for that. Economic growth would also just be good for the fact that you have more possibilities, more enjoyment of life. Things are less of a struggle with more economic growth. So, right, so we're going to look at what we had in the previous chapter, right? All of these principles, these design principles for how do you build a good policy, but how do we now balance it? How do we align it to both get the environmental goals that we're seeking, but also make the market people happy? So what have economists, especially those who we would typically associate with the University of Chicago, which is kind of where we see those who focus on markets a great deal, what kind of government policies have we seen? That typically we've had four different types of policies. These four types of policies have been direct regulation, Pigouvian subsidies, Pigouvian taxes, and tradable permits. Let's, I guess talk briefly about each of these here. Direct regulation, well, that would be, typically what we associate with, for instance, like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Fisheries Division, or the Forestry Service, where they just say, thou shall not, right? You have very strict rules about what you can and cannot do. And if you don't do those things, well, then you have a punishment, right? A fine, something like that. That would be old school government regulation. That would be the kind of thing you saw in the 1950s, 1960s, and even a little bit into the 1970s. Things started to change a bit in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, we saw more of these Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. These come from an economist, actually with the University of Chicago. And Pigou's idea was that why do we think that when there's a market failure, why is it that when the market fails that the government has to get involved? Right? So again, these people at the University of Chicago really love Adam Smith and this idea of laissez-faire, hands off with the government. And so they're like, why does the government have to insert itself when the market fails? Right? Why does it have to be, why is the only solution to a problem direct regulation? And so the idea is that if you thought of there being positive externalities and negative externalities, that you could subsidize things, provide a payment by the government when that thing generates a positive externality. So for instance, solar panels, you get back almost half of the money you put into solar panels, you get back as a tax credit. Everyone right now is getting a $7,000 credit if you buy a new electric car, right? With the idea that you're doing something good for the environment, and so you should get this money to compensate you for that positive externality, rather than mandating that you have to buy a government car, an electric car. The government's just saying, hey, we'd really like you to, and if you do, we'll give you this money. And then we would just have the Pigouvian tax, an acceptance of the idea that what you're doing is generating a bad thing for the rest of the world. It's generating this burden, this negative externality that's not captured in the market, and you should have to pay us for it, for creating that waste, right? And so you see that, for instance, when you pay your car registration, for instance, that you, at least here in the state of Hawaii, that we have to pay, we pay a registration rate based on the weight of our vehicle, with the idea that heavier cars burn more fossil fuels, heavier burden on the streets. And so, right, there's more of a negative externality, so there should be more registration, those kinds of things. And then in the 1990s, we have, starting in the 1990s, we have these tradable permits. Right, so now, again, with the University of Chicago kind of proceeding a little bit more, from the University of Chicago, we get this idea that why is it then that we just have to tax and subsidize, right? Why can't we just let the market figure these things out, right? The government could just tell people what the cap is, and the market will figure out, well, the market will dictate how businesses achieve that amount. Right now, for instance, here in May of 2025, right, companies are doing some changes, but they're not making monumental changes, and they don't necessarily have to, because in this case, this example, this just one well-known example, is that Tesla, because it's only making electric cars, is allocated all of these permits to pollute, which they're not using, which they can then sell to the other auto manufacturers, which are still 8 out of 10 cars made in the United States are just still gasoline-powered engines. Right? So they have no reason to make only electric cars, because they can just buy the permits from a company that's only making electric cars. Right? And so that gives you a great deal of flexibility while still achieving the goals that you're trying to achieve, to get. Now, again, let's look at, just with all these, let's look at examples. So we have the ones, no lead in paint. DDT was this thing that killed insects, but it also turned out to make eggshells very brittle, so birds birds' eggs were not hatching because the bird would sit on the egg and the egg would crack open before the bird. We see with refrigerants, right? I have this really old fridge in our house from when it was built in 1986. Apparently, it has stopped working, but they can't fix it because it contains a really old refrigerant that depletes the ozone layer. Right now, they make a new kind of refrigerant, but my old fridge doesn't take it. So I have no choice but to buy a new fridge, right? Um, there's really no other option for me. So, right, but this was just a direct regulation, right? Stopping something that's harmful to others. The idea is that, in some sense, is that they are so harmful, these things, that we shouldn't even allow a little bit of it. Um, we just want to completely ban people from DDT, using DDT as a pesticide. Just as we want to ban people from using asbestos, just as we, as a way to stop fires, or something along those lines. It's pretty straightforward, though, as the last bullet point highlights. It's straightforward because you just basically say, this thing is so bad, we can't use it anymore. Um, we see, with the way that, to be honest, with the way that motor vehicles are, for instance, you can't buy a car that, obviously they have certain safety standards they have to follow, but also all cars that are produced have catalytic converters, which stop a lot of harmful gases from being emitted. Companies that have like a smokestack, right, that are putting pollution into the air are stopped from doing, mercury into the water or mercury into the air. In some states, you even have to do a emissions test with your vehicle. Different states do different things. And again, they're nice because I shouldn't say nice, but they're easy to implement because basically you just say what the limit is and you basically aren't allowed to exceed that. And if you do, you'd face jail time and then you would have to stop doing whatever it is that you're doing. So it's a very, I say this lightly here, but it's pretty dictatorial, right? And obviously, that's why some people really resist this direct regulation approach. Um, what we see is that instead of setting limits, sometimes, right, and saying so many parts per million or parts per billion or whatever the um, problem might be, sometimes we just require them to use a certain technology to kind of reduce things, right? So again, for instance, for motor vehicles, we force these catalytic converters to be used. But for instance, it's only in the state of California that they require like a certain kind of catalytic converter, right? So I own a Toyota Prius, and apparently they had a very valuable kind of catalytic converter that came from the manufacturer, one that was actually better at reducing emissions. And so in California, if you get your catalytic converter stolen, you are forced to get a new catalytic converter from Toyota, which really reduces the pollution emitted quite a bit. But in the other states, if your catalytic converter stops working or gets stolen, you can just buy a cheap one from the internet, which might not really reduce pollution that much. Right? So there's a lot of wiggle room here, but what is this all a matter of saying is that, in terms of direct regulation, you could just say technology is always evolving. You need to use the best available control technology to ensure that we reach these certain limits. And we do that most notably with the clean air laws. And that required, especially we saw this a great deal with the burning of coal to generate electricity, is that um, coal burning power plants, especially in the 1990s, ended up having to burn a different kind of coal that produced less carbon dioxide and less sulfur in the air. And that happened in part because the technologies changed, both in burning the coal and how it was being used to make electricity. So the regulations, then you get that flexibility that we were talking about earlier and how you design a good policy. There's your flexibility. We see this as well when we're talking about renewable resources, this kind of direct regulation. And what we see is that there's certain regulations in terms of, for instance, when you can fish to prevent overfishing, right, in order to allow fish to, reproduce during, for instance, a spawning season. Right, or you could force fishers to not use certain kinds of gear that are more destructive to the environment, like certain kinds of netting and whatnot. And right, again, these regulations are all designed with trying to preserve um, uh, sustainability goals. The advantages and disadvantages should be quite obvious to us. The disadvantage, the biggest disadvantage, and the one that's getting all the kind of heat right now, is this idea that you don't have any micro level freedoms, right? So the idea, right, with the Republicans and the Trump administration was that businesses and even people to some extent don't have these freedoms that they used to have. And so because they don't have it, we need to get rid of these regulations. That's primarily what's being said. But think about what also could be said, right? If we only had direct regulations, it's not entirely obvious that Tesla would exist today because, right, companies would be told you can pollute a certain amount. So if Tesla is making cars that don't produce any emissions, they would have no incentive under just a direct regulation framework to make cars that make no pollution, right? So there's no incentive for surpassing your goal. Maybe if you turn it into like a marketing campaign or something, but you're only going to do as much as you need to so that it's good enough. The advantages is that you can pretty much ensure that you're going to reach your goal because the goal, once it's set, you have law enforcement, you have the tax authorities and whatnot to make sure that your regulatory caps are being met, and you have a little bit of greater assurance that the resources that are renewable, as long as you've set the right limit, are going to continually be able to renew. Now, let's go from the regulation to the taxes. So now this brings us out to about the 1970s. So in the 1970s, again, Pigou, again, the alternative is, why do we always have to be regulated? Why can't we have some more freedom? Why can't we, have these incentives to structure the production of our product as we want to? So we need more of a market. So again, the idea is that what is an environmental problem? It's a market failure. What is a market failure? In this case, you would use a tax because you have a negative externality. What is a negative externality? A negative externality means that the costs to society are greater than the cost to you as an individual. So all that we need to do is find out what is the appropriate amount of production of this thing that's producing this extra cost. And then we just need to tax it. Find out how much we'd have to raise the price essentially of the good to get it to be produced less. Because with this negative externality, markets tend to overproduce a good with a negative externality. So we need to raise the price to reduce its production and thus save the environment. So what we would say, right, is that every time you do something, right, you should have to pay this, in some countries, not in the United States, but in some countries, there's a carbon tax, right? And that carbon tax would be the cost to the environment and the cost to society when what you're doing has generated this carbon, which is, heating up the earth. And so then obviously if I'm facing this carbon tax, I might travel less, right? Because of that extra tax that's being imposed. That tax, it doesn't matter whether it's put on the producer or the consumer. Economists don't care who's ultimately responsible for legally remitting the tax to the government, because the tax will then be separated between producers and consumers depending on their elasticities, how badly they need this good. But what we would generally see is that taxes are pretty effective at reducing the risk in this kind of way. If you impose a tax, like on, for instance, on sugar drinks, it turns out that people will buy less sugary drinks. We, as an example that goes outside of the environment, right? How did we get people to stop smoking? We tax them a lot, right? In Hawaii, we actually increased the age to smoke to be 21. So you have to be 21 to smoke in Hawaii. But the bigger reason why people don't smoke would be, it's like $12 a pack of cigarettes, right? Whereas in North Carolina, right, where they grow the tobacco, there's practically no tax. Same with Missouri, right? In the state of Missouri, where I used to live, there was even a sign because people were taking cigarettes, buying them in Missouri, and then driving them over to Illinois, where the tax was much higher, to resell them, right? And there was a sign that basically said, it's against the law, don't do this anymore. It turns out that taxes, by raising the price, do stop people from doing the thing that has that negative externality. And then we would do the opposite for the things that we could do that benefit the environment, right? So again, I talked earlier about the one that existed for, having solar panels. I bought a heat pump for our water heater here in Hawaii, and I got a rebate for that because that was a better way of generating hot water. There's a tax only because we just did taxes not too long ago. I could have gotten a tax rebate if I had been growing some trees that, are more in danger, right? So that would have encouraged me to grow, these like precious trees or something like that. So again, you incentivize, encourage people to do something that provides that kind of benefit. Now, Pigouvian subsidies don't always work. And the reason why these Pigouvian subsidies don't always work is because individuals might not necessarily see all the advantages. So I did do the solar panel one because the advantages to me were going to be pretty obvious, right? I wouldn't have to have I wouldn't have to be paying these big electric bills and whatnot. But the heat pump for the water heater, I was kind of on the fence. Yes, there was a sorry, there was a there was a rebate for having these, uh, sorry, 1 second, I'll just pause here 1 second, sorry. So, when we see, sorry. So when we see this idea of the heat pump, for instance, for the water heater, I was a little bit more on the fence because it turned out it is more environmentally friendly and there was this rebate for doing it, but it doesn't generate hot water as quickly. Um, so, right, and you see this sometimes as one of the consequences, one of the negative points of a Pigouvian subsidy is that it's really hard sometimes to incentivize people enough um, at the individual level so that everyone benefits. Same with this, like, growing these trees that we don't have enough of, particular species of trees that we don't have enough of. I haven't planted any of them. There's an incentive to do it, but I'm not doing it because I don't have the expertise to grow things like that. And I don't think there's enough of a benefit to cover me doing that. And so that's where we kind of see sometimes you really just have to force people to do it rather than giving them more of a subsidy. That's kind of the debate we're having right now, by the way, about these electric cars, right? Is that do you tell people, we're going to outlaw gas powered cars, or do you just provide incentives for people to buy electric cars? Or here in the state of Hawaii, it's the law that by 2040, all electric has to be made without fossil fuels, right? So no burning of oil and everything like that. The problem has been, right? And so they provide all these incentives for using renewable fuels to generate electricity. The problem is that people aren't doing them enough. And that gets us now to the 1990s and pretty much the system where we have today, where, yes, we still have regulations, we still have Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, but the biggest thing we're really using are these tradable permits. Um, you know, we're doing these things where, for instance, I talked about the Tesla example, but another example would be you see these things where, it's a business now to grow a forest and use all these trees as carbon offsets that you can sell to companies that, are producing carbon, right? So they take you, the person that grew all these trees, who has all these carbon reductions, and you're going to make a business of it by selling those permits to companies that are polluting. And so the market exists. It's at the Chicago Board of Trade, the CBOT, and yeah, it's one of the big things that are traded there. The beauty of these tradable permits is that we know that the goal is going to be met. We know that the goal is going to be met because that's how many permits exist. And the market then businesses can decide. They have a great deal of flexibility of how they're going to meet their goals. Are they going to do it by buying permits, or are they going to make a business like Tesla does again, where they're going to make a business selling the permits rather than buying the permits? But right, if we want to think about what could go wrong with these permits, is you could, issue too many. You might be, in some sense, picking the winners and losers. For instance, Tesla, in some sense, has a unique advantage over the traditional car makers because they're just on the right side of this bet right now. But what happens if tradable permits lose a great deal of their value? Then the innovator in the production of electric cars, Tesla, then could go out of business. But the nice thing about tradable permits is it gets companies to do the right thing, but not for the right reason, right? They're doing it because, right, they don't, when a business sends you something and they say, we want you to do paperless billing because we want to help save the environment, they don't really want to help save the environment. They just want to reduce their costs, right? And the way they, right, by us doing paperless billing, then they don't have to produce as much carbon in their activities or whatnot. So it's um, we're not exactly, the businesses have an incentive to act right, but they're not necessarily doing it for the right reason. Okay.